Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. This is Madiha Sahib from Department of Zoology, Bank Road Campus, University of Education, Lahore. So, students, we are discussing different topics of evolution and principles of systematics. This course is mainly led by Dr. Muhammad Mudassar Shahzad as a main teacher. He's from Division of Science and Technology, UE, Lahore. So, the topic which we are going to discuss today is Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection, right? So I want to connect this lecture with my previous lecture because we have talked about the Darwin's theory of evolution as a mechanistic approach. In our previous lecture we have talked about the common design, gradualism, population speciation, and natural selection. So today we are focusing on the Darwin's theory of evolution by means of natural selection. Natural selection have the following postulated involves the following points: overproduction, competition, variation, and heritable variations. So in today's lecture we're going to discuss about these 4 points of the theory of the natural selection. Okay, students, before going to our actual topic, that is the natural selection, evolution by natural selection, I want you, all of you, to have a difference or to have the clarity, to know the clarity between the two views, that is the Darwin's view and the Lamarck's view. What was the Darwin's view about evolution and what was the Lamarck's view about evolution? Lamarck always thought that every individual of the population goes through the same change, but Darwin thought that not all individual goes through the same change, only few individuals go through the change. How? Here you can see easily that this is the Lamarck's view, representing Lamarck's view that original population of the giraffes had the short neck, right? They are the ancestral giraffes. What happened, because of the scarcity of grass on the ground, they need to take their food from the tall trees, so they tried to stretch their necks to reach to the trees, right? Tall trees. So what happened, by continuous stretching until the neck becomes progressively longer, and according to Lamarck, this trait of the longer neck because of the stretching would pass on to the next generations, and the descendant generations would have the long neck giraffes. But on the contrary, Darwin and Wallace view was quite different. What they thought that in the population there is variation. In the population, not every individual is same. There is a variation in individuals of the population. Already in the original population of the giraffe, there are the some giraffes that have the most of the giraffes have the short neck, but there are few that have the long neck by nature, right? So what happened when there would be the scarcity of grass or food on the ground, nature selects or nature favors the longer necked giraffes, right? So these giraffes reproduce more and more, and after many generations, there is still variability in the population, but the giraffes with the long necks are much more in number in the population, and only few giraffes with the short neck remain in the population. Why? Because nature selects the or nature favors the this trait, long neck trait of the giraffe. Okay, natural selection. The precise definition of natural selection is that all the species of organisms arise and develop through the natural selection of small inherited variations that increase the individual's ability to compete, to survive, and reproduce. So, what is natural selection? In a simple way, we can say that the adaptation of an individual to the changed environment is called the natural selection. Individuals adapt themselves to the environment, to the changes in the environment, and those individuals that can adapt themselves, that can adapt themselves according to the environment, so environment or nature selects only those individuals to propagate further in the life, right? And definitely those individuals, when they have adaptations, they have the variations that are favorable to the nature. These variations passed on to the next generations, and ultimately they the whole generation or population adapts itself according to the environment. So natural selection is often called the most unique part of the Darwin's theory. Competition is also called the struggle for life, had been thought as a reason that given that a given species might succeed or go extinct. This depend on the competition between the individuals of a population, that which individual will succeed in life, get its survival or survive properly, or which individual will die, and which ultimately which species go extinct. Evolution by natural selection. Well, Darwin termed natural selection as the major mechanism of evolution. The further points which this theory has were: number one is the overproduction. Well, all organisms have much more potential to reproduce, right? So, for instance, if we want to quote any example here, let's take example of female sea star. It releases about 1 million eggs each season. So, what would happen if all these eggs will be fertilized and developed into the reproductive adults? Suppose then each reproductive adult then produce almost 1 million eggs in the next season. So what happened? Resources of the oceans uh, will be exhausted very soon, and the ocean will be soon filled up by the sea stars. Like you know that if you talk about the oyster also releases 100,000 eggs in each spawning. So same would be happen. Now what happen? There is a overproduction. There is a potential in an organism to produce much more offsprings, but the nature selects, or and available resources selects that how many organism will survive and will be developed into the reproductive adults. Okay, second is the competition. Competition is what? Competition is to compete with one other to attain or to achieve something, right? So here we are talking about the competition between the individuals of a population, because resources are limited. Resources are what? Resources, if we talk broadly, that resources means something which we have in stock, right? So here resources are limited in our environment, so everybody has to struggle for his or her existence, right? For her survival, for his survival. So here, because resources limited, existence is a constant struggle. If we talk about the resources of the environment, then resources are the food, resources are the habitat, resources are the mate. These are the three basic resources that an individual needs to survive or to make his or her existence. So here, if you can see that we environment has the limited resources, lack of food, there is a lack of habitat, no shelter is provided to most of the individuals, lack of mates, so not all individuals will survive and reproduce effectively. So competition is always there for the survival. Darwin thought the competition and struggle for life might be the reason for the survival or extinction of the species. Organisms are capable of producing more offspring than their environments can support. Individuals are more, resources are less. So there will be a competition. Thus, there is a competition for limited resources in each generation. Third point is the variation. Well, it is the key ingredient for the survival of the species. Variations are what? Variations are the changes. These are the varieties. These could be phenotypic. These, what you can see with your eyes in the body structure, could be changed. As we talked about the finches, there is a variation in their beak shape, right? We talked about the tortoises. There was the variation in their shell pattern, in their neck length. So variation is very important because this helps the animal or individual or organism or plant to adapt to its environment. So these variations could be phenotypic as well as genotypic. Variations are also present in the DNA sequence in the heritable material. This variation could be present in genes, I mean coding region of the DNA. This variation could also be present in the non-coding region of the DNA. Nucleotide sequences. I'm talking about the nucleotide sequences of DNA. So, individuals with characteristics best suited to their environment are more likely to survive, finding food, avoiding predators, and resisting diseases than those species who have no variation or who lack beneficial variations. So variations are very important, and these variations occur in response to the changes in the environment, right? So if we take an example, this will lead to the survival of the fittest, right? You have listened the term in the natural selection also, the survival of the fittest. So what is, after competition, the individuals who have the best suited variations, who can adapt to the environment, or who is the fit, will survive. Fit will survive. This is what survival of the fittest. If we take example of nowadays example of COVID-19, so the people who are immunocompromised, whose immune system is not strong enough, right, or who are already unfit physically, having some kind of health problem, having some kind of disease like sugar, asthma, these people are more affected and more vulnerable to this virus, right? The healthy people who have the strong immune system, or you can say who are the fit, these can survive and can defeat the COVID-19, right? This is the very, you can say the recent, I could give the example of the survival of the fittest, or the variations that leads towards the healthy lifestyle. Okay, second point in variation is variation exists within all populations of organisms. This occurs partly because random mutations arise in the genome of an individual organism, and their offspring can inherit such mutations. Mutations are what? Mutations are the change. Mutations, broadly speaking, or generally, mutation means change. So, as we are talking about the inheritable mutations, so these are the mutations that are being present in the DNA sequences. In the DNA sequences, I mean nucleotide sequences, in gene sequences as well as DNA has two kinds of sequences. Some are coding regions, some are non-coding regions. So these mutation could be present in both. So these mutations occur randomly and could inherit and could be passed on to the offsprings. Throughout the lives of the individuals, their genomes interact with their environments to cause variation in traits. Traits are what? Traits are characteristics. Definitely, our genome help us to cope with the environmental factors, and this will naturally leads to the variation in our genome as well. And these variations in our genome would be sometime phenotypic also would be seen, like longer neck and changes in the beak of the finches. And these traits passed on to the next generation, and ultimately the generation would be developed into a new species. This is what evolution, this is what the concept of the natural selection. This is what change in the organism and ultimately change in the population. Fourth one is high table variation or adaptation. Um, well, adaptation is what? Adaptation, this is what we were talking in our previous slide as well, that adaptation is a quality of someone to adapt or to mold itself according to the habitat, according to its surrounding, according to its environment, right? So this is what adaptation. Let's read. Adaptation is the dynamic evolutionary process that fit organisms to their environment, right? Adaptations helps us to fit ourselves in our environments. It is a state reached by population during that process. During that process mean during the process of the evolution, finally what the population, ultimately the variations in the individual pass on to the next generation, then generation, as we talked, that it is a very gradual process. So ultimately the population adapts itself to the environment. It is a phenotypic trait with a functional role in each individual organism. Phenotypic trait, the trait which can you see phenotypically or apparently, right? As the beaks, change in the beak structure, it is a phenotypic change. So functional role means that that is active, that is not vestigial. So phenotypic trait that is active uh, in each organism, and that is maintained and has evolved through the natural selection. This is what all adaptation. adaptation obviously takes place through heritable variations, the variations that could not be inherited, that can't make the adaptation in a population, that can adapt only an individual, but heritable variations can adapt the population because they are inherited to the next generations. Third, fourth point is, as the traits that are helpful are heritable, an organism with these traits leave more offsprings, the traits will tend to become more common in the next generation. All right, this is what we have talked about a lot. So Darwin reasoned that the individuals that die are those with traits that make survival and successful reproduction less likely. Obviously, those organisms that die in the population were not the fit one. They could not compete for their survival, right? And these are those organisms that have the traits that are less fit to the according to the environment. That's why these organisms die. uh, and they die, that's why they couldn't produce. So production takes place only by those organisms that have the fit traits, right? Fit according to the environment. So traits that promote successful reproduction are said to be adaptive. Definitely, if a trait that could be passed on to the next generation, that could make the adaptation. So adaptive traits are perpetuated in subsequent generations because organisms with maladaptive traits are less likely to reproduce. Organisms that are not physically fit, that have maladaptive traits, that cannot reproduce, so that cannot contribute to the next generation. Only organisms with the favorable traits could reproduce and could inherit or could pass their traits to their upcoming generation. Well, this is an example how natural selection can take place. Here you can see the frog population of the frog, reproductive ability, tendency of for geometric increase in number. This what we are talking about in the natural selection. What is this? That this is the population of frogs, right? Population frogs has ability to produce much more frogs. Geometric increase mean too much increase. They could increase their population too much. But what happened at the same time when a population has the ability to increase geometrically, environmental restrictions are there. And what are the environmental restrictions? Environmental restrictions are the limited resources. Limited resources in terms of food, in terms of shelter, in terms of habitat, in terms of mate, right? Next, struggle for existence. When once individual has been produced and after coping with the limited resources, they compete with one another for the struggle. This is the what struggle for existence. This is what competition. Struggle for existence is known as the competition. When they are competing with one another, plus their heritable variations, their genetic traits would help them to compete. Who don't have the heritable variations, who don't have the favorable traits from who don't get the favorable traits from their parents, will not could not compete, could not defeat the others, and ultimately die, and only these two could survive in a population. Now here what happened: natural selection, persistence of adaptive variations. Now the individuals who survived in the population have the persistence, have the adaptive variations, means these have the variation, those variations help them to adapt to the environment. That's why they compete and they won and they survive. Plus environmental changes. And ultimately what happened, evolution took place, and there is a differences in adaptation, and these differences you could see apparently as well. These arise in the phenotypic changes or phenotypic variations, in terms of phenotypic variations as. And finally what we have this cycle. This is the whole process of the evolution by means of natural selection: reproductive ability plus environmental restrictions. Only few individuals that compete, that have heritable variations, could survive. right? These uh, organisms or frogs that survived after competition because of their heritable variations, they have still persistence adaptive variations, and that help them to cope with the environmental changes, and ultimately these variations could appear in further generations. Phenotypically these variations will be appeared, and finally evolution took place. Okay, students, let's now recapitulate or recap all the things that we have talked about yet about the Darwin, his ideas, his mechanism, his evolution in the form of a very short documentary. Let's recapitulate our lectures. Okay, students, thank you so much. Have a nice day. Have a lovely day today. Allah Hafiz.